After weeks of protest that increased after his weekend decision to remove his defense chief for dissenting, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared late Monday that his administration will defer a proposal to reorganize the court out of national responsibility. From a wish to prevent the nation from being split apart, I am calling to stop the legislation, Netanyahu said in his address, according to a translation. He spoke hours after Israel's largest airport closed, its banks closed, and hospital workers went on strike, joining hundreds of thousands of other Israelis who have vehemently protested Netanyahu's proposal to implement new judge selection procedures that could benefit the embattled prime minister if convicted of corruption charges. After Netanyahu said Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on Sunday for calling the law a immediate and tangible menace to Israeli state security, protest grew. Though Israelis have criticized the proposed policy for weeks, many saw Netanyahu's decision to summarily fire such an important cabinet member as a particularly egregious abuse of power at a time when he already faces criticism for attempting to dismantle governmental checks and balances. The scenario here on the ground is a state of madness. Peter Lerner, Director General of his State Drugs Foreign Affairs Division, told Monday morning. Gallett's firing was unacceptable and the last straw, he said. Israel hears him. Lerner claims society is being torn apart. Netanyahu must halt this now and allow dialogues. The Prime Minister was due to address on Monday but merely sent a brief message on social media. Netanyahu tweeted, I appeal on all the demonstrators in Jerusalem on the right and left to behave properly and not to act violently. According to Hebrew translation, brotherly people hours later, a far-right coalition party said Netanyahu had disagreed and over-delayed Jewish Power stated the measure would be reviewed in Israel's parliament next session to pass the reform via dialogue. Passover will break parliaments next week. Netanyahu addressed the protests that have pitted left-leaning and centrist Israelis against religious conservatives and right-wingers in an 8-minute Hebrew speech. I will provide a time out for discussions if negotiations would prevent a civil war, he declared. As Israel approaches its 75th independence anniversary, many Israelis call the current upheaval a cultural crisis or even an existential one that threatens to change the country's identity. Netanyahu's proposal measures would limit the Supreme Court's authority and make it harder to remove a leader deemed unfit to serve, a significant move for a prime man facing corruption charges. Protest leaders called it totalitarian. Netanyahu, who has led the Jewish state for 15 of his 26 years and presently leads for a weak far coalition, made his statements after global crisis had been exponentially harsh. We are profoundly disturbed by today's actions out of Israel, which to further underline the urgent need for compromise. White House National Security Council spokeswoman Anthony Watson said last Sunday. As the president recently discussed with Prime Minister Netanyahu, democratic ideals have always been and must remain a cornerstone for the US-Israel relationship. Checks and balances improve democratic society and substantial changes should be pursued with the broadest possible popular support. We urge Israeli officials to reach a compromise quickly. Watson said, we think that's the best for Israel and its people. Others who have followed the embattled prime minister believe the latest civil unrest shows a dramatic change in his leadership. Netanyahu's image as a political magician who can deliver their dreams has been shattered, tweeted Economist magazine biographer Ashnil Piffer. The partners enjoy their new ministries and won't give up on them so easily, Before said, suggesting the ruling coalition will survive. Analysts claim President Joe Biden hasn't invited Netanyahu to the White House because he's worried about the issue, despite close US-Israeli relations. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin blasted Israel during a visit earlier this month. but the administration has been accused for not taking a tougher line against Netanyahu's anti-democratic activities. It has been distressing to see this lack of teeth to any of the US responses. Sarah Hicks, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who worked at the State Department on Israel-Palestine policy, told Reuters earlier this month. They don't get the same kid gloves that they have always been treated with because they are the root of their being democracy anymore. US News reported that India was able to repel a Chinese military incursion in contested border territory in the high Himalayas late last year due to unprecedented intelligence sharing with the US military. This caught China's People Liberation Army forces off guard, enraged Beijing and appears to have forced the Chinese Communist Party to reconsider its land grab strategy. A source familiar with the previously unreported US intelligence review of the encounter in Arunachal Pradesh says the US provided real-time details to India of Chinese positions and force strength before a PLA incursion. The US provided the Indian military with actionable satellite photography and more detailed and faster intelligence than before. It mattered. On December 9, hundreds of troops with spike clubs and tasers clashed, resulting in a dozen injuries and Chinese withdrawal. They were waiting. The insider said the US gave India everything to prepare for this. It demonstrates a test case of success of how the two militaries are now cooperating and sharing intelligence. Several current and former analysts and officials, some speaking on the condition of anonymity, confirmed details of the encounter and the American rule, including unprecedented ground support from the US military to India. This was the result of new era of cooperation between the two powers to counter Chinese expansionism. The new partnership worked well in the remote region, but it has major consequences for how the US and its allies might counter Beijing's land acquisitions there and elsewhere. The PLA probes and tests. They want to know how the Indians can and will respond and to see what the Indians can detect, says Vikram Singh, a former Pentagon regional problems specialist now with the US Institute of Peace think tank. China is ready for the war. In the weeks before the encounter, the US government was aware that Beijing was testing its ability to gain a foothold in isolated mountain routes or other terrain claimed by both China and India. Several hundred PLA forces on the Chinese side intended to march forward and stay near the unofficial borders as they did in 2020 in the Galwan Valley, several thousand kilometers to the west, the last time the two military clashed. Both sides lost many in that fight. Using US intelligence, the Indian forces intercepted the Chinese. The basis for the new intelligence sharing arrangement originates from an agreement the Indian and US government signed in 2020 known as the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement on Geospatial Cooperation or BECA. The fourth agreement enhanced military, logistics, compatibility and security information exchanges between the two states. The BECA is public but sharing intelligence for action has not been reported. It's unclear why the Chinese evaded Arunachal Pradesh at that time, like with prior battles where its forces did not escape triumphant. Its state news services and public leaders have been rather quiet about the unpleasant encounter. A foreign ministry spokesman said the border was generally stable days later. We do not have information on this issue for now, a Chinese government spokesperson told US News. However, a second, less reliable US intelligence assessment suggests the Chinese paid particular attention to several US military activities in another region in the weeks before all the part of unprecedented training exercises. The Indian military hosted with the 11th Airborne Division, reactivated in 2022 and based in Alaska, tasked with the Pacific operations. The visiting Americans held a promotion ceremony for four officers at a staging area in the shadow of Nanda Devi, India's second largest peak and a cultural symbol for the surrounding communities. China considered the exercises proactive. They held an impromptu rock concert with the locals at one base. Public affairs staff advertised both incidents in the late November and early December days before the Arunachal Pradesh clash, which the intelligence assessment indicates infuriated Beijing. Numerous current and former authorities claim that was intentional.